Hello, 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 and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today I have a slightly different type of episode than usual. I did something similar at the end of my series on Oregon State Hospital, so I'm trying it again this week. Today, we're going to discuss some of the continuing legends and lore from Willard State Hospital. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I will state upfront that I am a skeptic at best when it comes to ghosts and spooks and such, but I do enjoy ghost stories. I tend to think that most spooky, ooky stuff can be explained away rationally, but I don't want to deny someone of their lived experiences and perceptions. Sometimes people witness things they can't explain. And of course, every culture throughout history has its different ways of explaining the unexplainable. So many of these paranormal stories end up being their own sort of cultural artifact, the culmination of how this people group decided at this moment in time how to explain something that happened. I'm fascinated by it, so I'll try to keep my skepticism to myself and let you decide what seems real and what doesn't seem real. So I'm drawing information for this episode from multiple sources, so be sure to check out the end of the transcript for a full list of resources and links. I'll also include more pictures than usual to the Facebook group and Instagram page, so be sure to check those out as well. I'll also add that I looked really hard for the Destination Fear episode on Willard State Hospital. It's season 1, episode 12, just for reference, but I could not find it. Everywhere I looked only had videos up through episode 10. Like, I couldn't even find a transcript or a description, so that was a bummer. And lastly, I want to offer trigger warnings for references to death by suicide, which I'll discuss twice, and abortions. I'll be sure to give a heads up before discussing those topics so you can skip ahead if you'd like. So come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Willard State Hospital. As you'll remember from previous episodes, Willard Psychiatric Center closed as a psychiatric hospital in 1995. Later that same year, the remaining buildings that were still usable were repurposed and became the Willard Drug Treatment Center for minimum security prisoners. This essentially served as a diversion program to avoid sending nonviolent drug offenders back to prison. And the Willard Drug Treatment Center remained open until the fall of 2022. Now the campus is empty. Some of the older buildings are in more advanced states of decay, and there's a chain link fence that surrounds the condemned buildings, but people still find a way to sneak in there, which is not only trespassing, but it's also incredibly dangerous. There are many sections where both the roof and the floors have caved in, so going inside certainly puts them at risk. They may get harmed and have no way to alert others if they've been injured. Still, many people vie for the chance to go inside the old asylum and see what or who remains there. In 2007, administrators at the Willard Drug Treatment Center contacted Ryan Buell and the folks at the show Paranormal State to investigate the old asylum campus. Staff had reported that they were getting too many complaints about possible hauntings in various buildings around the campus. Specifically, they were getting complaints about disturbing activity at night. 2 sergeants had reported that they heard a woman screaming at them inside the staff dorm. Michael LePage, a staff member at the drug treatment center, was setting up in a classroom when he heard a noise in the hall. When he stepped out into the hallway, he reported seeing a slender woman standing in the hallway. She screamed and then disappeared. Lisa Bordeaux was in a rec room when she felt like someone was standing over her shoulder. She heard the lock on the doorknob click. The door was pushed wide open, but no one was there. And this is where I'll advise you to skip ahead about 30 seconds if you don't want to hear mention of death by suicide. Chris Carroll was a former nurse at Willard back when it was still a psychiatric hospital. She didn't report seeing any ghosts, but mentioned that there were several patients who had died by suicide while she worked at the hospital. She mentioned one woman who drowned herself in Seneca Lake, which bordered the hospital, and another woman who hung herself in her room. And she seemed to infer that the hospital had negative energy that surrounded it because of its dark and complex history. It's still shocking to me to think that half of the patients who were admitted to Willard never left. They would die there. And as I mentioned in previous episodes, the Willard Cemetery was about 25 acres large, and the remains of 5,776 patients are buried in numbered but otherwise unmarked graves. In the episode of Paranormal State, they scanned the cemetery with a camera. Now, I had seen pictures of the cemetery from when Lawrence Marek was the caretaker and more modern pictures, but I didn't get a sense of just how large it was until I saw that footage. And because the markers are flat discs on the ground, the cemetery just looked like a giant field. Except for the headstones of the veterans of the American Civil War, there are no other names anywhere. There's unlikely to be any way to identify the graves based on the number alone, since those records are long gone. In the episode of Paranormal State, Ryan Buell and the other members of the Paranormal Research Society, or PRS, have permission to be on the Willard grounds and film their experience. They're joined by Chris Coffey, a psychic and medium. Since this is television, everything is made extra dramatic. They film after dark with candles and flashlights guiding their way for that extra spook factor. Chris, the medium, enters the hallway that appears to house the electrical circuits and fuses. He passes through a doorway and pauses. "Stop," he says to no one we can see. "I'm getting yelled at all over the place." He says that he senses the spirits of multiple former patients. "There's such overwhelming anger and sadness in this building," he says, and I definitely agree with that. Even modern-day psych hospitals have a sort of heavy weight or negative energy around them because there is so much anger and sadness and distress. Chris listens for more messages. "They're saying, 'Let me out,'" he tells the crew. "People died here who shouldn't have died here." And again, I totally agree with this. The average length of stay for a typical patient at Willard was 30 years. 30 years. And remember that most of those folks had not committed a crime. Their mental illness or physical disability was treated as the crime. And Chris went on to listen some more. He said there was one active spirit in that building, a nurse who acted as a sort of guardian. He said she came to alleviate the suffering of the others and to help the other spirits to not be stuck there anymore. He said they still feel like they're trapped in the hospital. Now, in order to get a better sense of who they were talking to, the Paranormal State crew pulled out a paranormal investigative tool they called Frank's Box, which they described as a telephone to the dead. They described it in more engineer-type language than I'm capable of repeating, but the gist was that the box pulls white noise and pink noise from the area and translates it into the voices of the spirits lingering there. They set up Frank's Box and begin asking questions. "How many are here?" someone asks. The box hisses and crackles, and someone hears 7 from that noise. "There are 7 spirits," one of the crew says, "and 1 demon." And the rest of the people look at each other nervously. "A demon?" One of the spirits identifies herself as Lucy. She's the spokesperson, or spoke spirit, of the group. The box hisses and crackles again. Lucy is apparently telling them the demon is holding them all there. Just then, one of the crew sees a shadow shoot across the wall, and Chris the medium runs to chase after it while everyone else seems to worry about his welfare. Then they find themselves in an old bathroom, a line of individual stalls on one side and sinks on the other. "Bad vibes in this room," they say to one another, and they quickly hustle out. They decide they need a little extra help on this investigation, so they call in Lorraine Warren, a demonologist. As soon as she arrived and entered the building, Lorraine, who presents as a sort of hip, grandmotherly type, says, "This is awful, honey. People are crying out for help." She goes on to explain that the spirits of the former patients can't escape because the demonic spirit is holding them back. So she joins in the crew in helping contact Lucy. Meanwhile, Chris, the medium, appears to be channeling the spirits in another room. He cuffs his neck in one hand. "He's choking her," he tells the others. They ask who, and he says the demon is choking Lucy. "Lucy died trying to protect the people here," he explains. Then, in a moment of heightened drama, Ryan asks Chris for the name of the demon, and Chris hisses out a scream and a curse word. "Ah!" "Chris, do you want out?" Ryan asks. And Chris chokes out a "yes." And then one of the women on the team slaps him across the face, and the spell appears to be broken. The next day, Ryan Buell, the lead paranormal investigator, speaks to the staff member that invited them to Willard. He tells the staff that they found evidence of 7 spirits, one named Lucy, and a demon. And the staff member kind of smiles and tells him that, many people have reported seeing or hearing a ghost named Lucy in the building. She's supposedly a former nurse from the hospital. So the paranormal state crew find a room of records and search for a nurse named Lucy. But there were too many documents to sort through, and the search turned out to be futile. They asked the former nurse, Chris Carroll, if she had known a nurse named Lucy when she worked at Willard. Chris, though, just shook her head and said there were too many nurses and too many patients to keep track of them all. There probably had been a Lucy, but none that came to mind. Now, interestingly, these were not the only stories about Lucy. A YouTube host named Grace Raven also posted a story about a red-haired woman who was a former nurse turned patient at Willard. She was known for screaming at night. One visitor reported feeling a warm, blowing sensation on his face and felt like someone was placing their hands on his cheeks. Raven also told the story of a tour group at Willard. One visitor had sensed someone behind him, turned, and saw a woman in her 20s in a faded white nightgown with long, messy brown hair, dark eyes. He wasn't afraid. He just felt sorry for her. Somehow he knew that her name was Emma, and she was scared and sad. Later that day, he connected with another woman from his tour group who had had a similar experience, except the spirit that she had encountered was named Emily, but the description was the same. Raven also told the story of 2 people who were out for a drive near Seneca Lake. As they passed by Willard Psychiatric Center, one of them reported that his head hurt as he was driving by, like hands pushing on either side of his head, and his stomach felt funny. He said he sensed the energy from the spirits of former residents. But all of a sudden, poof, his face felt warm, as if going through a warm mist. And he sensed many different energies, more than a few all at once. And as soon as they could no longer see the hospital, the feelings all went away. They drove to the end of the road, turned around, and when they passed the hospital again, both he and his partner saw the sign that read, Willard Children's Facilities. Real estate Pamela Pariso, who has a YouTube channel on various historical stories around Seneca Lake, also reported the story of the ghost with the red hair as a common occurrence. Pariso also reported that the ghost of a doctor in a brown suit is said to haunt the premises. She told a brief story about going out to dinner one night, and she and her friends were talking about the steam tunnels under the buildings at Willard. A man from a table near them overheard the conversation and piped in, saying that he had worked in the tunnels and had seen a demon. Pariso said that the man seemed as though he had been drinking, but he was insistent on his story. Remember that the crew from Paranormal State indicated that they had also seen or determined that a demon was on site, and that it was the demon that was preventing the other spirits from leaving. At the end of the Paranormal State episode, the crew said they cast out all of the spirits, good and bad, so they could go to wherever they needed to go next in their spiritual life. They then invited community members to Willard Cemetery to have a memorial service for the deceased patients. The service was ecumenical, with leaders from different faiths taking turns presiding over the memorial. And I thought that was a nice touch, since we can't make assumptions about every patient having the same religious or spiritual affiliation. I hope that the community members, and whatever spirits may linger, felt more at peace after that ceremony. In 2012, the Travel Channel show Destination Fear filmed an investigation on the Willard property. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I wasn't able to find this video. If anyone has a link to it, please feel free to email it to me. I'd still like to see it. But this episode sparked increased interest in the public wanting to explore Willard and search for ghosts. So when Willard announced that it was offering a hospital tour that was open to the public, they planned for a crowd of 500, like they had at their previous hospital tour 8 years earlier. But this time, because of the Destination Fear episode, 4,000 people showed up. Hundreds of cars lined the road to Willard, and state troopers were called in to help manage the overflow of traffic. Many people waited for hours, only to turn around in frustration or be turned away once they got closer to the hospital. Because so many people had showed up, some visitors insisted on seeing the hospital, tour or no tour. They snuck into closed-off areas that were not on the tour and caused property damage, all in the name of ghost hunting. The following year, in 2016, the hospital opted not to open for a tour because of the destruction from the previous year. And I wasn't able to find out if they've been open to the public since 2015. But that certainly doesn't stop people from coming to the property and sneaking through the fence to catch a glimpse of the infamous decaying ruins. In 2018, urban explorer Dave from Freaktography went to Willard to tour the buildings in their current state. He has a 2-part video series on YouTube where you can see inside the buildings. One building where he films is the Maples, but I wasn't sure what the other building was that he filmed in. He was there with a partner who called himself Rhythm Rider, and they walked through the buildings with minimal commentary, though lots of profanity at the beginning, fair warning. And they had handheld cameras. And everywhere they walked, there was a roof caved in or a giant hole in the floor. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of waiver they had to sign to get in and what kind of liability insurance the hospital would have to cover something like that. And as it turns out, the answer was none. The 2 videographers snuck under a fence and broke in. And since police officers patrol the grounds regularly, they stayed quiet and away from windows, watching for patrols as they went by. Now, I don't condone trespassing, especially in a condemned building where somebody could easily be injured or worse, but I will admit that they got some stunning photographs from their visit, and I'll attach some to the Facebook group and Instagram page. Much of the footage that Dave captured from the hospital included shots of long, dark corridors and nearly empty rooms. I say nearly empty because there was quite a bit of old furniture left behind. And I always find it kind of sad, but it's understandable that so many pieces of old furniture get left behind. It's not like you can really take it to a thrift shop because it's already so outdated and far from hygienic. It certainly can't be used again, and I doubt museums would want all of that furniture left behind. So it sits there to collect dust and rot. And as Dave carefully maneuvered around the soft floors, he captured video of a room full of old wooden chairs. Alone in what was probably a single bedroom was a safety seat for toileting. Another similar room had a wheelchair. Stacked in what appeared to be a former dorm room were several metal bed frames. And nearby, a mattress had caved in along with what used to be the floor of the room. Dave and Rhythm Rider managed to walk up to the 3rd floor of the Maples, where the floor was extremely soft and malleable. They called it the most dangerous area of their tour. They walked back down to the 1st floor, where the floor was still in relatively good shape. They walked into a large activity room where they discovered 2 old record players and a broken film projector. Perhaps that room had been a music or entertainment room at some point. You may remember from a few episodes ago, I'd mentioned that Hadley Hall had been the main building for recreation and music therapy, but I'm sure they had activity rooms all over the hospital where people could listen to good tunes. One area they visited appeared to be where medical procedures had been performed. And this is where I'll advise you to skip ahead about a minute and a half if you don't want to hear about gynecological procedures, including abortion. Although he didn't film this area, Dave captured images from what appeared to be the woman's health clinic. You may recall from a previous episode that I'd mentioned that women were given gynecological exams upon admission, whether they needed them or not, whether they consented to them or not. If a woman didn't consent to the procedure, it was forced on her. And the trauma and violation they would have experienced it's really tough to think about. And it's hard to tell from the images, but the chairs for the gynecological exams, the ones with the footrests at the end, appear to be made of some sort of faux suede material. And I really hope I'm wrong about that, because goodness knows it would be impossible to clean and sterilize. And this one is labeled abortion chair. And disturbingly, the rust on the footrests looks a lot like blood. It's alarming. Remember that the early 20th century was the heyday of the eugenics movement, and people with mental or physical defects were not considered fit for reproduction, let alone parenthood. It's very probable that pregnancies were terminated so that patients could not pass along their genetic lineage. Others, no doubt, experienced forced sterilizations to prevent pregnancy upon their return to the community. There's another picture with what looks to be a machine for electroshock therapy. It's been a few years since I've seen a modern version of an ECT machine, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. From the picture, I can read TD5 on the machine, but nothing else is particularly identifying. It looks like it may say TRCA above TD5, but I'm not sure. So if anybody knows for sure what this machine is, please let me know. In another area of the abandoned building, there were old patient documents strewn about, just kind of unprotected. Dave held up a piece of paper with hearing evaluation form written at the top. The name of the patient was written underneath and dated September 1973. And next to it were multiple colorful images that looked like they were intended for children, like a clown, a ball, etc. In another room was a patient's x-ray from God only knows when. I'd really like to know why some of these patient documents got left behind. Like, was that an accident? Were they packing too quickly? Why weren't they moved to another building along with the other patient records? I just wasn't clear. There's a lot about the footage from the freaktography videos that I appreciate. For one, I love images of old hospitals. From an architectural standpoint, the old Kirkbride buildings were truly stunning, even though Willard wasn't in that style. The buildings really were quite simple in their overall design, but there was so much beauty in them. The brick archways throughout the underground tunnels and the large picture windows in almost every public space and the sweeping grand staircases. I just love old photographs of these buildings, even in their decay. And that's really what led me to start this podcast in the first place. I also can't help but notice the many ways in which psychiatric facilities have improved over the years. And again, I'm going to put a trigger warning on this section for suicide. Skip ahead about a minute and a half if you're not in a space to listen. While Dave filmed the various rooms, he didn't see what I saw, what I've been trained to see. Because when I looked at the wooden furniture with slats on the back of the chairs and couches, metal bed frames with coils tangled up, and room after room of traditional doorknobs, all I saw were ligature risks. See, In modern psych hospitals, we have safety standards we need to meet in order to ensure that our patients remain as safe as possible. One of the main aspects that I look for as a psychologist is for anything that someone could use to harm themselves or someone else. And unfortunately, that involves thinking outside the box of the many, many, and I hate to say creative ways that someone might try to die by suicide. But most notably, any surface that could be used to tie a ligature or noose is considered unsafe. Traditional wooden chairs that most of us have in our kitchens with cross rails or slats, those are ligature risks. A traditional ball doorknob, ligature risk. Metal headboards on a bed frame, ligature risk. Even ADA accessible features like grab bars to prevent falling can't have a space between the wall and the bar in those facilities. And before I ever worked in a hospital, I would have never thought about those things, but now I'm constantly looking for them at work. I'll include a couple pictures of doorknobs and grab bars that we use today in psych hospitals and in prisons. And to get back to the spooky ghost stories, once Willard became a drug treatment center, inmates also began reporting ghostly appearances. According to the U.S. Ghost Adventures website, inmates have reported seeing shadows moving in and out of cells every night. They've reported seeing the corridor lights flickering uncontrollably. And they've also sworn they've heard laughing and the sounds of bowling pins being knocked down, even when no one was around. Who knows what could be lurking around there now that the entire facility has been closed down? Could the spirits finally get some peace and quiet after all? I always wonder what draws people to creepy old asylums. I mean, for me, it was because I was born across the street from one. Oregon State Hospital has been part of my history since day one. And today, people seem to be interested in asylums for paranormal reasons or maybe a little bit of true crime. Think of shows like American Horror Story Asylum that continue to fascinate people. It's not a new phenomenon. People seem to have been intrigued by asylums since their genesis. And I found a short but good article in the Monitor on Psychology by Jennifer L. Bazar, something like that, and Jeremy T. Berman that addresses what they call asylum tourism. Since it's short, I'm going to read the whole thing. I'll include a link to the article in the episode transcript. And here's what they say. Quote, alongside mentions of monuments, churches, and historical sites, a 19th century tourist in New York might have found this recommendation in his or her guidebook. Visit the Bloomingdale Asylum for the Insane in the Morningside Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, on the grounds of what is now Columbia University. The approach to the asylum from the southern entrance is highly pleasing, reads the 1880 guide, Miller's New York as it is. The author continues, the sudden opening of the view, the extent of the grounds, the various avenues gracefully winding through so large a lawn, the central building is always open to visitors, and the view from the top of it being the most extensive and beautiful of any in the vicinity of the city is well worthy of their attention. Recommending a visit to a mental hospital might seem surprising to modern readers, but this was not unusual at the time. In fact, the asylum tourism of the late 1800s was less voyeuristic than its earlier incarnations. The patients, sometimes including the powerless wives of jealous or bored aristocrats, had often been treated like animals, housed in institutions that were little more than human zoos. It cost only a shilling to see, quote, the beasts rave at Bedlam, as Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, England was then known. Following the rise of the 19th century of moral treatment, insanity came increasingly to be recognized as a curable disease. It was argued that because this disease was caused by the draining away of one's mental energy, the mentally ill, as the insane ultimately came to be known, needed only a few things to recover: rest, meaningful employment, appropriate amusements, hygienic conditions, and kindness. New asylums for treating insanity were therefore built for that purpose. every element of the buildings, both inside and out, was considered an integral part of treatment. This new philosophy, cure rather than incarcerate, spread quickly. Throughout the 1800s, institutions opened in large numbers across the Western world. And with this change also came a change in tourism, a shifting from viewing the insane to viewing their asylums. The attraction of the asylum shifted from witnessing the bedlam of a human zoo to admiring the material side effects of this shift toward treatment. Beautiful gardens, manicured lawns, interesting architecture and proportions that rivaled most cities' greatest wonders. In short, the change in thinking about insanity made the change in asylum tourism possible. The timing for this was good. Before the 19th century, long-distance travel was an expensive privilege reserved for the upper class. With the dawn of the 1800s came the railroad, improvements to roadways, and the emergence of the steamship industry, making travel faster, cheaper, and easier. These new travelers relied on guidebooks to learn about the history, customs, and attractions of their destinations. Guidebooks like Miller's New York offered detailed railway itineraries indicating highlights that could be seen from the windows of the train, as well as the attractions at each of the stops, such as Bloomingdale Asylum. Private institutions such as Bloomingdale did not garner all of the attention. A similar entry in the Englishman's Illustrated Guidebook to the United States and Canada, also published in 1880, recommended that tourists visit the nearby publicly funded New York Asylum for the Insane. A visit to this institution will well repay the tourist or philanthropist. The scenery in the vicinity is very beautiful, assured the guide. This change in tourism received mixed support from asylum superintendents. They didn't all encourage it. Some found that tourists distracted staff from the patients in their care. Yet others did include visiting hours in their annual reports, which in turn were often printed in the local newspaper. And still others posted their hours on signs. Janet Murin, author of the 2011 book Prisons, Asylums, and the Public, has argued that for asylum administrators, encouraging tourism became a way to gain the public's confidence. It also discouraged skepticism regarding treatment and helped address the social stigma surrounding insanity. Current anti-stigma campaigns do something similar, although with mental health rather than mental illness. Like the 19th century asylums made more accessible by technological change, leading present-day mental health centers are becoming increasingly integrated with their neighboring communities. Two such examples are the newly opened Worcester Recovery Center and Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the renovations in progress at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. Such facilities are returning to the idea that beautiful buildings and manicured grounds present a welcoming, healthful face. But a move toward openness on its own is not sufficient. Some mental health centers have adopted the moral treatment philosophy of meaningful work, and some now even make it possible for patients to display and sell their artwork or handicrafts. Most, though, have also forgotten that this was once itself an integral form of treatment, and it was associated with a shift worth preserving. Patients visited, not viewed. End quote. And that last line is what I really like about this article, and really what I hope you'll take away from this episode. That ghost stories are fun and all, but the patients at Willard were real people. The stories of their lives deserve to be told fully and honestly. I'm not sure what Frank's box can offer in terms of helping relieve the spirits of the dead, but I hope that by sharing their stories, somehow they're offered a bit of solace, that they're seen and somehow their humanity can be restored. So many people at Willard and hospitals around the country were denied the chance to live authentically. I hope we can continue to do better for our patients both today and in the future. And that's where I'll end the story of Willard State Hospital. I really enjoyed this series. I hope you did too. I feel like I could keep telling more patient stories from this hospital, but I'm sure they would never end. I wasn't able to find evidence of the museum display of the Willard suitcases. It might, I don't know, it might be too far in the past now. But if you come across it somehow, please let me know. I'm sure it'd be amazing to see all the pictures of the suitcase contents and the stories of the people who once owned those items. So starting next week, I'm going to begin a series on a hospital not in the United States. We will travel across the ocean to Europe. But where? Find out next week. As always, thank you so much for listening. I'm just so heartened to see the number of listeners going up each week. And I'd love to find a way to make this podcast more interactive. The easiest way to do that is to join the Facebook group and Instagram page, or feel free to send me an email at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. But if you have other ideas of what might be a fun way to interact, let me know. I'd like to see what you come up with. And as always, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.